Winslow Homer was born in Boston in 1836 into a middle-class family, a mother with an interest in art who encouraged him. He himself had his early training in engraving. Homer found work with Harper's Weekly, which was one of the most popular middle-class magazines, which made great use of illustrations in the publication. When Civil War broke out in 1861, that suddenly became the consuming interest of America and of Harper's Weekly. Homer was sent to the Union Army front in Virginia, where he was embedded with the troops. He was one of about 30 artists who were covering the war, producing a steady stream of images, but his were always among the most powerful and direct.
It's at that time that we see his first finished oil that he debuts publicly that engages a Civil War subject, and that is his sharpshooter painting. This work is so powerful because he's meditating on the moral and human stakes of this war.
It is a very menacing image. Homer himself said it was as close to murder as anything he'd ever seen. Homer understood that often the most powerful image would derive from focusing in with great attention on specific details, which he rendered with great directness. He once said, "When you paint, try to put down exactly what you see. Whatever else you have to offer will come out anyway."
Homer is seeing the war in all its dimensions, from the boredom and hunger of camp life to the terror and visceral terms of the violence of battle. Homer likely suffered some type of trauma following this event. His mother, Henrietta Homer, writes that when Winslow Homer came home, he was so changed that his best friends did not know him.
So after the Civil War ended in 1865, there's a period of what's called reconstruction, and it's all about kind of reintegrating the southern states.
I think Homer realized that the Civil War had not solved America's problems. Reconstruction wasn't working, and he became fascinated with depicting post-war African-American life and hinting their lot was still a very difficult one. It is Homer addressing a new dynamic, a new social relationship that people are trying to negotiate.
Then the cotton pickers, and we have these two women in the field, beautifully rendered by Homer. However, we have to remember that a lot of them basically were forced to become laborers once again on the farms of same plantations that they worked on during slavery. They're still living in a deeply racist world. We see the rise of things like the Ku Klux Klan, the Jim Crow laws, that are just another way of almost policing African Americans. These are people who are actually still under kind of forms of slavery. So I guess the question is, to what extent could he truly understand the lives that he was depicting?
In 1881, Homer decided to come to England, but after only about a week in London, he goes up to Cullercoats on the North Sea, a fishing village. It was the site of one of the life-saving brigades, and it was also an artist's colony. And I think Homer imagined he would find interesting subjects there.
My connection with Winslow Homer is my grandmother, Maggie Jefferson, was painted by him several times. She was his favourite model, his muse. Fisher Girl with the Net is, I think, on this pier here. And I can see her coming along there with the net. I like the way she's strong-willed. I like the style of her, where she holds herself. I like the swirl of the skirt. It's my favourite painting of all time. The Fisher Girls would have been down here from early morning. They would have had creels and babies on their back. Bold, fearless. They always wore a nice scarf, like a cravat, and a paisley blouse. There was nothing drab about them. They were only 14 or 15 years of age. That gives me a lot of pride to think that these girls, in their poverty, could rise above it all and make something of them and still be immortalised today.
There are some paintings, such as The Gale or Inside the Bar, where you can see these beautiful, monumental, but also graceful women bracing themselves against the strong winds. There's a sense of awaiting and hope, and also fear for these women who don't know if their men will come back or not from sea.
The families who lived in colour coats in Homer's times, they were all God-fearing folk, and each family had a pattern for their jumper, because when some fisherman came in drowned, they would know which family he was from by the pattern on his jumper.
Colour coats was the perfect spot for Homer to record and to observe what was called at the time the theme of perils at sea. Drownings and shipwrecks were daily occurrence. We know that between the 20th and the 22nd of October 1881, a big ship called the Iron Crown foundered at the mouth of the Tyne. As soon as Homer heard the alarm, he made his way to the shore and he started sketching. The rescuers themselves provided Homer with a good artistic material. In a painting like The Life Brigade, he depicted all these men looking at the horizon, at the sea, and we don't know what they are looking at, but there is this sense of anticipation and waiting and trepidation, which is part of the way Homer constructed the narrative of his paintings.
In the summer of 1883, Homer goes to the Maine coast, rocks and waves crashing, very simple life, very austere, very elemental in its confrontation with raw nature, and that will feed his art for decades to come.
So we are standing in Winslow Homer's studio home, which is perched on the rocky coast of Maine in a town called Prout's Neck, which bore a great deal of similarity to Colour Coats in the sense that it was also a fishing community, also coastal, and he produces some of his most celebrated, iconic works in oil in this very spot.
At about this point, Homer begins to go south to the Caribbean every winter, Florida, Cuba, Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, to observe life there. Many of the works are watercolors, very bright color enters into his vocabulary, sun-drenched scenes, but at the same time, he's interested in depicting particularly the life of the black residents of those islands.
Winslow Homer painted the Gulf Stream in 1899. He is 63 at the time of its making. This is Homer's legacy picture. He is depicting a lone black sailor who is in a state of peril in a damaged sailboat lost at sea.
He writes on the bow of the boat so we can make no mistake, Key West, this is an American boat. This is an American figure who is in peril, surrounded by sharks in the water, an almost elemental scene of imminent demise, one of the strongest pictures of his career.
The sail is slipping off to the side, useless, with nothing but several stalks of sugarcane to sustain him, a predominant commodity and product of enslaved labor in the Americas and the West Indies trade.
When you think of the Gulf Stream, you think of the currents that allowed for things like the triangular trade and the slave trade. From Homer's perspective, you know, he thinks he's rendering this larger-than-life, poignant figure, but what he's also doing is putting his own perspective of what that kind of heroism is.
It becomes almost an allegory of what he sees as the present fate of African Americans. We do not know if he is going to be saved. Will that ship see and rescue this man? The possibility is there, but Homer doesn't tell us.
Every time I look at the painting of the Gulf Stream, all I see is how it's really relevant to today, to contemporary society. I think of forced migrants crossing the Mediterranean, migration of Cubans to America, and the loss of life along the way. What it captures is the continued imbalance of power that often falls along ethnic and racial lines. Paintings like the Gulf Stream have captured the imagination and the collective consciousness of many people, especially African Americans and African American artists and thinkers and researchers.
I first learned of Winslow Homer's Gulf Stream painting via another painting that was in response to Homer's painting by Kerry James Marshall, which depicts 4 black figures sailing on calm waters, enjoying their time in control of their own destiny. And that sparked me to want to find out more about Homer's painting that was the catalyst to this artwork. I wanted to make a piece that was conscious of these ideas of both artworks, but also creating something altogether new that could function as a sculpture that could transform itself, that as viewers see it from a distance, it goes from being a boat to being this anthropomorphic vessel that has this structural system made of 12 ribs and with a spinal column. To the viewer, they see the title of the Gulf Stream on the stern that might spark an idea of greater connectivity or research in terms of the notion of the Gulf Stream and the slave trade past might connect with the sculpture.
Homer becomes increasingly enamored with the ocean to such an extent that he begins to really remove and omit the sense of human narrative from his works and rather focus on the grandeur and awesome power of cresting waves and the sort of ceaseless beating of their rhythms across the coast. And he's interested in different timescales and questions of geological time and the broader universe of nature and man's small place within it.
Late Homer is focusing on the elemental in nature, the thing from which nothing more can be subtracted. It is just archetypal confrontation, his ability to manipulate paint, and that technical power meeting with the simplicity of the theme represents his final great statement.
Homer fabricated a sort of romantic ideal of this isolated, introspective artist. Here at the studio, he featured a sign that is iconic that says "Snakes, snakes, mice" to ward off unwitting visitors, and his door knocker was the head of Medusa, safeguarding his privacy, warning against visitors, but it's always with a wink and it's always with a sense of humor.
He was living most of the time in great isolation, shunning most people, but I always think that he kept his eye on the train schedules back to New York, and he could get there quickly and carry on his business. He wanted to be a very successful, financially remunerative artist, so he is producing the kinds of images that his essentially American clientele did indeed respond to. Arguably, Homer was the most famous living American artist when he died in 1910. And very interestingly, most artists' reputations undergo decline after their death. Homer's never has. He paints wonderful images of sociability, of children playing, etc., etc. But throughout his life, he keeps returning to those moments of conflict, of contestation, war, racial relationships, violence, the peril of mankind confronted with nature. These are issues we continue to deal with, and we are realizing how forthrightly Homer did so more than a century ago.